Speaking of songs, last week's new song was There Is a Balm in Gilead, and it stuck in my mind so much so that I did offer it up again this week. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to save a sin-sick soul. I figure this happens to everybody, but with me, it happens frequently that my thoughts about something transport me to a different time and place. And wandering around this past week with those lyrics in my head, I was somehow landed back in 1986 in the central coast of California in the Santa Cruz Mountains. That's where there's redwood trees with those fist-deep crags of bark, and they fill the mountainsides. It's a place where the forest canopy is so dense over sections of Highway 9 that in the middle of the day, as you're driving, your automatic headlights turn on in the perpetually dark sections. In 1986, there were 3 or 4 weeks of straight, hard rain. And we watched as those mountainsides became saturated. And when they reached capacity, walls of mud and trees slid down, overwhelming the bottom-dwelling creeks. And all of the hydrologists and foresters who are in the audience today know the power of those kind of slides. You can watch as trucks are swallowed and just floated off the street, and houses crack and pop, only to be found in pieces somewhere else after the rain stops. I remember a woman was killed in one of those slides. She was trapped in one of those houses whose pieces would be found later way downstream. I wrote a poem about that rain, and when I read it again last week, I realized why There Is a Balm in Gilead landed me 34 years in my past. Here's that poem. 2 weeks of rain, last rain suit in the store, rubber pants, knee-high boots, digging out just to stay ahead. A woman lay buried somewhere beneath the mud that took her home. I'm sure she waited for it to stop. She was a writer. She would have written about it stopping. Now I write about her screaming, "Stop!" 2 weeks move into 3. The bottle on the porch fills in a few hours. Tip it again just to see. I know it's raining. I know the baby's got bronchitis, coughing all night. No sleep. 3 o'clock in the morning, there's a cough. The window leaks. The rain suit is ripped at every seam. I read her body finally flowed with the mud into the river. The rain gave her up, but it's still raining, and I want it to stop. As I read the poem, I was transported back to today. The rain suit that is ripped at every seam today has not been torn by water, but by the ravages of isolation, illness, and death due to COVID-19. Any remaining shreds have been pulled apart by our witnessing the inescapable lethality of hundreds of years of racial oppression that we cannot and we must not unsee. As I read the news, as I talk one-on-one with many of you, I realize that our collective and individual souls, like the raincoat, are bursting at every seam. As your lay minister, I'm going to be straight with you. Damn, I do hope there is a balm in Gilead to soothe our souls. And I recognize that hoping for a balm may seem heretical within some folks' sense of our Unitarian Universalist tradition. Some might not think there is a balm. Some might think that balm carries with it a relinquishing of our agency to some omnipotent power. We might distance ourselves from the whole concept of a balm. But I'm hoping you might stay balmy, or balm inclined at least, with me for another 8 minutes or so. I've been told that some natural body balms are extracted from the oily buds of trees. There's an organized, explainable process for making these natural balms. I want to propose an organized process for making our soulful balm. So far, I'm calling that process active persistence. I'll come back to that. An active persistence is far from yielding our agency to some higher power. The first part of this process calls on us to recognize and energize individual action. This is not meant to be some sticky, sweet exhortation to hang in there, baby. You remember the poster of that kitten with two paws hanging onto the bar? I'm sure we want each other to hang in there, but that's not what I'm offering. And it's not that we're hanging onto that bar alone. Joanna Macy talks about our connected self. She writes that it is from our connected selves that much of what people most value in life emerges, including love, friendship, loyalty, trust, relationship, belonging, purpose, gratitude, spirituality, mutual aid, and meaning. When we identify with something larger than ourselves, whether that be our family, a circle of friends, a team, a community, that becomes part of who we are. There is so much more to us than just a separate self. Our connected self is based on recognizing that we are part of many larger circles: family, friends, this fellowship, community, nation, and world. Those connections take action on our parts. We have to cultivate connections. We share of ourselves and embrace others as they share of themselves. Clearly, this fellowship practices joys and concerns each week. Sometimes we have to lift up a tear in our soul, and sometimes we have to listen to another's. And sometimes that listening calls us to act. I think this reciprocal action of sharing and listening and the follow-up action is the beginning of applying balm to our individual souls. Through our connectedness, we'll not only help to heal ourselves, we'll also practice healing our collective soul. When we really hear the story of another, we'll be compelled to act. In recent months, that which is slicing through our collective soul is the undeniable, unavoidable terror and oppression we haven't really heard in the past. Through great pain, the survivors are due our action now. I am certain that action will take varying shapes for each of us, but we each must be active. We must all be active as we journey towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community that our actions that accountably dismantles racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. You'll recognize that that is a quote directly from the text of the proposed eighth principle that we've talked about before. I am also moved to recognize that from that quote, in ourselves and our institutions, could just as well read in our individual and collective souls. The second half of making a balm for our souls, I initially called out as patience. You'll see that in the published title of this sermon. But in writing this, patience proved to be a profoundly difficult word to invoke in these times of crisis. The end goal of our COVID-19 responses must be informed by science, supported with intention and driven by a real sense of our common good. As infections and deaths continue to rise, there is no room to be patient with assaults on science, a politicized sense of intention, and overwhelming selfishness. Patience didn't fit. Race scholar and activist Dr. Maya Nigel Hoskin wrote in a recent Medium article that fighting anti-Black racism is a lifelong commitment and a process. The end goal is for a society to be better and for Black lives to matter to everyone. Robin DiAngelo, in her book White Fragility, also wrote that interrupting racism takes courage and is, by definition, not passive and complacent. It is a messy, again, lifelong process, but one that is necessary. And that eighth principle once again invokes the sense that our journey towards spiritual wholeness, of our journey towards spiritual wholeness, in all of these examples, the messy, lifelong journey we're heading off on is not bounded by patience, it is propelled by persistence. I am certain that within ourselves, as we move forward, we will be confused, exhausted, and dispirited at times. But we will carry on. I'm also certain that we will be disappointed, frustrated, and temporarily disconnected by the actions of others, and yet we will carry on. We will carry on because this is when and where our congregation lives up to its intentions, not only in our care for one another, but our care for community and our care for the nation and our care for the planet, but in support of each other's persistence. Over the next few sermons, I will describe practical ways we can persistently move forward. You will find that most of these practical opportunities will have many different places for you to become involved. Start where you can. You may join us in an online vigil rather than marching across the bridge. You may be the chairperson of a new KUUF justice ministry. And someone else may send an email or make a phone call to their legislator. We can all act, and we can act persistently. We will continue in this messy, lifelong journey together. For the past several months, my kids, my former wife, and I have held weekly Zoom meetings. I'm sure some of you are doing this with family as well. At last week's meeting, my son, he's the youngest, and he was born about 8 months after that storm that was in the poem. And on this last call, he told us how he was worn out emotionally because of a torrent of hard personal stories that were coming from his crew of about 30 software engineers who were working remotely across the country. And these stories were coming packed in all at the same time. His boss was recently diagnosed with leukemia. Another colleague's mom suffered a stroke, was in a coma, recovered from that, and only to be mismedicated and returned to a coma. Another co-worker's partner was struggling with life-threatening complications in her pregnancy, and another engineer's grandmother had recently died. And my son was almost whispering when he said, and she was very close with her grandmother. He was astounded by this cluster of misery and wondered if it was always like this, or was he sensing it more during the COVID-19 time. He told us that he had been smoking meat and freezing it and planned the next day to Federal Express this frozen smoked meat to these people. He also said he had calls out to his coworkers, just telling them he wanted to hear how things were going. In that Zoom meeting, I wanted desperately to find a little balm to apply to my son's wounded soul. I tried a few words, but it wasn't until after the call that I realized he had been persistently acting in response to each of his coworkers. I smiled and realized that he had been doing what he had been doing for others had applied a little balm on my soul. We are truly in this messy, lifelong journey together. Thank you.